Welcome to the Theology in Motion podcast. Join us for conversations about the theology of worship, its practice, culture, and design. The Theology in Motion podcast is by the Center for Worship Leadership, Christ College, Concordia University, Irvine, in California.
Welcome to Theology in Motion. My name is Steve Zank, and on behalf of the Center for Worship Leadership, we're glad that you are here. We are honored to have on the show today's guest, Reverend Dr. Constance Cherry. She is professor of worship and pastoral ministry in the School of Theology and Ministry at Indiana Wesleyan University, a department she herself started in 2004. Dr. Cherry has served in full-time local church ministry as both director of music and worship and pastor. She is a founding faculty member of the Robert E. Weber Institute for Worship Studies, where she continues to teach in the Doctor of Worship Studies program. She travels extensively to speak nationally and internationally, is a published composer, and is the author of 5 books. Her first book, The Worship Architect, A Blueprint for Designing Culturally Relevant and Biblically Faithful Services, has been used as a required text at more than 150 institutions of higher education worldwide and is available in 5 languages. Dr. Cherry, it is our honor. Thank you so much for being here as a guest today on the show.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to this, and I'm really glad to be with you, Steve.
So today, let's talk about some of those issues of design and worship in the church. Why is this conversation about design in terms of worship so important for the church today?
Well, it's very important because I don't think that there is a consensus about what worship even is in many instances. And so in the last 50 years, I would say, we've, in many places, sort of gone our own way with worship, and we have followed a trajectory in some cases of our own making where we decide what it is and what we need to do. In some cases, we've been told that worship needs to function as a marketing tool. Mm-hmm. Some cases, worship is actually, used, so to speak, for evangelistic purposes. And so, at large, I think that there hasn't been, I think we've lost a bit of our moorings. And so when you talk about worship design, to me, it doesn't have to do with the micromanaging of the service as much as it does a general consensus that I would hope is based scripturally and in 20 centuries of practice in the life of the church, Big C, that can find its place there again, that would certainly still be interpreted locally. Now, so in design, I'm thinking more of shaping the service consistently in parameters that are set by Scripture. So I think design really matters because it's been up for grabs, that people have just thought we can do with worship whatever we want to do with worship. And I don't actually believe that. I don't think that we can do whatever we want to do in worship. I think that we are responsible to give shape to a service, design a service, if you will, but within the parameters that I believe God has set.
Yeah, and that's so important, I think, in our age where I think a lot of practitioners who are maybe listening to this podcast, they're used to just modeling things they see other churches doing. And I think a lot of cases, practitioners are just trying to get through a Sunday in a way that they feel good about what they've done. And maybe they haven't been trained and to think about these things theologically. At least they're trying to grab from things they see other folks doing.
That's really true. And I think that with the advancement of internet and all of the available examples that are out there, we haven't been necessarily training our worship leaders to be discerning about evaluating what they see and how that may or may not I would even be so bold as to use the word comply, as how these services may or may not comply to corporate worship as we understand it. So absolutely, I think that's a big point where people are out there searching, they're spending hours on the internet, pulling stuff up, swapping sites, and then worship can pretty quickly degenerate into, again, whatever we make it to be.
Yeah, and so for people who are working with these kinds of questions, or they're working with the task of leading people in worship, what kind of questions would you hope and encourage those leaders to think about when they go through to plan a service flow or pick songs or other parts of the service? What kind of questions would you hope that they'd be thinking about as they did that?
I think the primary question that would come to the forefront would be, does God even care about what we do? Because I think when you ask and answer that, you already have a space to work in. So if your answer is no, God doesn't care what we do, then I guess you're free to do what you want to do. But if you answer that question, does God even care what we do? If the answer is yes, then immediately we're led to, oh, well, what does God care about and what does God think about this? And so to me, that's the starting place. I have heard a lot of young people. I teach people 18 to 22-year-olds, and I teach all ages because of my work at the Robert Weber Institute. So it's not indicative of one generation, but most of the people I work with are younger, and I'll often hear this say, even seasoned pastors say, God doesn't care what you do as long as your heart is right. I hear that quite a bit. And it gives me pause because I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I know what they think it means, but if we're depending on our heart being right as the permission slip, if you will, to do whatever we want in worship, I don't know who has a completely pure heart in this matter, but even if so, that's not the indication we get from Scripture, is that God doesn't say, hey, if your heart's right, you go ahead. But in fact, it's almost the reverse, where God says, let my heart be right and you follow me. And I have found, I'm spending my lifetime just trying to study, reflect, practice what I find, and I make no claims that I understand all this fully, even after many, many years of doing this. But I do have, of course, a developing sense of some non-negotiables that I would say God has for us in worship. And then it becomes my obligation to find them, commit to them, and do them as I design services of worship. So these are general parameters. They're not the micromanaging of the service. I don't think God cares which song goes in which order, but God certainly does care how the service begins, how the service ends, what things are included in general, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and so it sounds like what you're leading us to is to recognize that God has a particular heart in regards to worship, and that though we, in a sense, design services, you would say maybe God is the master architect. Could you lead us through what kinds of things is God wanting to do as we gather in worship?
Well, one of the, first of all, you're exactly right. I mean, that is the kind of thing that I would hope for and that I am also pursuing as a practitioner. But it's just like God has a heart for worship. And so my job is to find God's heart for worship and enter into that as an agent, a human agent, someone who is called vocationally to disclose the heart of God in worship, so to speak. But the kinds of things I'm talking about, I can think of a number of them, but I'll begin with at the beginning, so to speak. But I would say that God's heart, to begin with, is one that takes the initiative to reach out to people versus us having the power on our own to initiate an encounter with God. So to begin with, I would say worship is initiated by God. God appears to us, God calls us, God comes to us in all of our relational experience with the triune God. It is God who calls, and to that we respond. And so in corporate worship, a really fundamental starting place is to understand that when we gather as the people of God, we do so in response to, in the Old Testament, what might be called the Call Yahweh, where there's an issued voice that says, "I'm your God. You're my people. Come and be with me in union with me, and I will speak. You will listen. You will speak. I will listen." But it begins with God initiating the action. So, I mean, that's one thing. And the other, I can go forever, so I won't, Steve. But, a second one that leads directly out of that is just that if that's true, if God calls God's people and says, I invite you to a corporate meeting with me, an identifying meeting of you're my people, it is dialogical in nature because God is relational in nature. So when I say worship designers have to think about conversation between God and people, sometimes I'll say worship is dialogical, God, people, people to people. That comes out of God's being. It comes out of who God is. God is a relational being, as evidenced in God's very being as a Trinitarian being, but in every aspect of the Christian narrative in Scripture, it is God in relationship with people. And so that means that as a worship designer, it's not a one-way liturgical experience, but it is a two-way or even a three-way liturgical experience where we are relational with God and one another as we enter into divine worship. So, I mean, these just spin out almost ad infinitum, where every aspect of worship really stems from who God is and the implications of that, and then I create or design services or craft them depending on how much any church desires or wishes, given their liturgical history or theology. Some have more freedom than others, but I do so, whatever I do so in response to my best understanding, weak as it is, in what God desires and in actually who God is to begin with.
So it sounds like there's a way in which you're saying God initiates the worship, so he's called the meeting. It's not like when we have a worship service together, we invite God to join us, but we're actually coming at his invitation. And this maybe is a metaphor that's a little bit different than what you talked about in your book, but it came to my mind, so I want to know what you think. Is it kind of like practitioners who are designing worship services are more like a sous chef than a master chef, in the sense that the master chef gets to set the menu, pick some of the ingredients out, but the sous chef is working on behalf of the vision of the master chef and doing important work. But there's a sense in which things are awry in the kitchen if the sous chef changes the menu.
May I quote you on that? That's a good analogy.
Well, if it works, then absolutely.
It's very much like that. It's very much like that. I mean, we're not the one calling the shots on worship, but we're turning our faces toward God and saying, this is yours, this is your service, this is your people. How may we enable them to encounter you in ways that are pleasing to you? That's a great analogy. I like it.
That's good.
I like it. If it shows up in the revised edition of the Worship Architect, you'll find your name there. Footnote.
Some footnote somewhere.
Right there.
So it sounds like there's a way that as we design services, God's a master architect. He maybe is laying the foundations. How can we kind of play with this metaphor, the architect metaphor, different phases of building? In your book, you do this. How could you help lead a practitioner to think about the way the service is built in this way, with this metaphor?
Yeah, so using the architectural metaphor, the principles, it's really astonishing. I'm not an architect, but I did consult some architects just to help me understand how they go about their job and the vocabulary they use, the concepts and so forth. And again, I'm only using this as a loose metaphor, but what struck me as remarkable is that really architects fundamentally think about their buildings in the same manner and with the same, again, the same parameters, the same restrictions, so to speak. But what's remarkable is that even though they're given the same, they have to follow, for instance, building rules. They have to have a good foundation. They have to have all of the setbacks in place, or whatever they're required to have. But in the end, every structure looks differently. I mean, in my neighborhood, I don't live in a cookie cutter neighborhood, but I live in a neighborhood where every house is different. Yet every house has a foundation, every house has walls, every house has a roof, every house has to have a certain space between the yards and all of that. But yet the creativity comes in the mind of the architect, who can create beauty and create functionality and warmth and hospitality within each of these structures. So I look at that a lot as a model for worship. So the foundational requirements come from God, and they're saying worship has to be from God's point of view. These are the expectations, this, and this. Another one would be centered in Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of every Christian worship service. So, those are set. And now, whether I'm in Southern California in an urban congregation or out on the prairie in South Dakota or wherever I am, that service is fashioned and will look very differently in how it feels, its context, its expressions, but yet it's going to be held to account for the things that are non-negotiable. And so, I think that's part of the beauty of being a worship architect. I do think that one of the things that I think if you could misread the book to say, oh, this is just like a blueprint for everything to look the same. And I would say the opposite. The blueprint comes where everything's going to look unique to the worshiping community, but the non-negotiable features of construction, load-bearing walls, the weight of the roof, whatever is required for solid construction, those we bow to. But the end result is very different and special and contextual. Yeah. So a good idea of a worship architect is producing services all over the world that look very, very different, but that have some commonalities that hold it together spiritually from God's point of view.
Yeah. Let's identify some of those load-bearing walls. So as you think about it, we have you said the foundation is in Jesus, but especially I think we mean by that is in him as the cornerstone of our salvation. Not just that we're gathering around Jesus's sayings or something, but that we're founded on his saving work for us on our behalf. What are some of the other, the load-bearing walls? In the analogy, what are some of those as you see them?
I have used that terminology to refer to creating rooms for the conversation. And so the way I describe it is that really load-bearing walls carry the weight of the functionality of the home or the building. And so what we're doing in the service itself is creating rooms for the encounter. And so I think of the first room as the room of gathering, where we come into God's presence, we acknowledge God's presence, we acknowledge one another, we give thanks for one another, we approach, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And this is very much like any kind of building where there's an entrance place, there's a space where the people step into and are identified as present and readied, so to speak, to move to the next level. I work off of the 4 rooms of worship that have historically played a very large role in the church, and actually the roots are found in Scripture, first of all. But the gathering and then the word, where there's a concentrated time of preaching and hearing from God, God directly speaking as we understand it to the people through the reading of the Scriptures and so forth in the sermon. And then a remarkable time of response where there is a room for letting this word settle in our hearts, letting it take root, letting it convict us, letting it draw us to the table and or other forms of response as needed. And then just like any other building, there's a space in which you exit. There's a space in which you define what you've been doing inside as being taken outside now. And so the sending is that. So I don't think of these sections of the service as rudimentary requirements that are stiff. I think of these as flexible places of engagement, but that they do lead logically from one to the other, so that we're not wandering in circles and we're not doing whatever comes next. I've had on occasion a student who will say to me, "Hey, Dr. Cherry, I want to be really creative in this service coming up." And I go, "Great, how are you going to do that?" And then they say, "Let's maybe start with communion." And then I would say, "Well, tell me why you want to start with that." "Well, it's different." And then I would say, "What is the role of communion?" I'm talking Holy Communion, Eucharist. And they say, "Well, then they get caught a little bit. But if it is historically or best thought of as in response to God having spoken to us directly, where we offer ourselves anew as new and living sacrifices and so forth, then probably not start the service with that. But it's for theological reasons that we make that choice, not because we want to do something creative. So I think of these, this is a very intelligent movement from gathering word, table sending. It is it's a normative movement that's relational. So it fits all of that, but it is so not rigid, because there can be, a different ambiance, a different experience in these rooms somewhat from week to week, but there's still a movement or emotion traveling through a relational encounter with God.
Yeah, what I find really engaging about that model is it also attends to the human aspect of things, in the sense that when folks gather in worship, they're coming from all kinds of places. Maybe we have a little baby at home, so maybe we're just trying to get our child in the door, and our heads are all over the place. And to be gathered intentionally, is not just a theological move, but it also seems to be an anthropological move, in the sense
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So, nobody's really prepared to walk in the door and sit down and be slammed with the sermon. But it is an anthropological necessity. Mm-hmm. There's real family dynamics that have to be in place. That's why, the beauty of even passing the peace is not a liturgical item as much as it's really a spiritually anthropological act, where we are we are claiming the oneness that is already our reality, but we need to remind ourselves and one another of that. And so you're absolutely right. And so some of this that's why, even though I think the primary movement is revelation and response, which suggests God to people, people to God, I've really been insisting that, a big part of the corporate worship experience is people to people. It's also the horizontal relationships that take place in this paradigm that are of utmost importance. Because otherwise, you're going to end up with, okay, there's 350 people here today, and everybody is standing and doing their thing, oblivious to everyone else around them, and it's about them and God. I hear that quite a bit. I see that quite a bit, where it's like a bunch of individuals that just show up at the appointed time, but that doesn't make corporate worship. Corporate worship is a horizontal relationship that fulfill the endeavors of worship together. And so that is a very big, and it's the same as ascending. I think when you part, like if I visited your home, Steve, I have no doubt that you would make me feel welcome, and that when I left, when I actually stepped over the threshold, you would say something to me of a parting nature. You would either bless me or just say, have a good day. You might even say, let me offer a little prayer for you. But there would be some sort of signal that I wasn't stepping into the dark without any sense of relationship or sense of connection to what had just occurred in your house. Yeah. So it's the very same thing, I think, in worship.
There's something about this revelation response paradigm that I want to kind of talk about more, if you don't mind. There's a way in which the movement as a whole, you're suggesting, goes from revelation to response. And I see that in the biblical narrative of worship, that God does something, he enacts something, he forgives, he initiates, and then as God's people who have received, we respond. There's like a pretty large movement of that. Do you see that also throughout the service? Sometimes that movement can have micro expressions, like a conversation where there's a revelation from the word or something, and people will respond in that moment, even though we're maybe still in the room of revelation, we're also responding there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's very important to understand revelation response. It's very important to understand it at two levels. This is happening at the macro level, where the service itself, in its big form, like gathering, word, table sending, or in its big, so to speak, symphonic form, revelation response is happening. However, it is happening at the micro level at the same time. And so even if you're in one of the rooms of worship, there's what I would call liturgical conversations that are playing out, that are carrying that portion of the service. So, for example, if you're in the service of the Word and we're preparing to hear the Word, we would have maybe a song of illumination or a prayer of illumination or some sort of acknowledgement that we need the Holy Spirit's power in order to hear the Word rightly. This becomes a part of the dialogue of that service. So there's prayer of illumination and perhaps a little sung response to that. And maybe again, after hearing the gospel reading, that's exactly what, praise to you, Lord Christ, is part of this revelation response that carries the inner dialogue and helps to create the outer dialogue all together. And so I do ask my students to pay attention. We're not just, looking at the big level, but to some degree, they love it, but to some degree they say I annoy them because I'll say, now, if they're in a contemporary service, let's say, and they're preparing a song set that, let's just say, has 5 songs, I'm going to ask them, in what way do those 5 songs assist in an internal dialogue of revelation and response? Are they helping the congregation to function and carry out this conversation with God in that manner? And so, then they go, well, wait a minute, I just was going from the mood, from, fast to slow, or I was going from key changes that I could easily do with or without my capo. Now you're asking me to think about the order of songs in terms of revelation response? And I said, yes, I am. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the conversation. It's a big part of the conversation. And I would even say some denominations have a longer history of this than others, but I would even say that part of the dialogue, again, is people to people. So looking for songs that encourage one another, songs that call one another to obedience, exhortation. I come from the Wesleyan tradition, and John Wesley was very fond of formal exhortations after the preaching of the word, and this was lay driven. It wasn't the preacher that did this, but an approved, in his case, layman, although he opened this up to women in his lifetime, that would say, now it's time for a lay leader to stand and exhort the community and say, in light of what we have just heard, what's it going to be? What will we do? What are we called to do? How will we do it? And so that's people to people is also a part of the dialogue that just needs some attention. I don't think it's the primary piece of the dialogue, but it is an important piece.
Yeah. When you mentioned your student kind of going with the mood and trying to plan a song set, it might be important for the listener just to mention that when we talk about this kind of fourfold order of service, that there are alternate ways of viewing this service that are not necessarily complementary, but there's a movement towards a threefold order of service that actually views the beginning of worship to be mainly about warming up the crowd for the sermon or something. And maybe it's important to talk about how some of these ways of building are actually in some ways at odds with each other. Is that the way you see it?
I do. I don't believe that means necessarily that worship is wrong,
right,
or heretical,
right.
But I don't think it's I don't think it's consistent. I liked your word. It's not in keeping with the best understanding of the event itself. So, especially in the evangelistic tradition and the free church tradition, of which my roots come, it was very much a song service had a job to do. The song service in the beginning, it was to set up the sermon. And I'm not Baptist, but I have some Baptist friends, and they very much, that they cut their teeth on this. And because the service of the word, the preaching was the pinnacle, and the result of that had to be profound in terms of response, and that is a paradigm that one could use, but I think you're really stretched to try to present that in a revelation response paradigm, in a very conversational manner. So, I'm very aware, very, very aware of what I think. In contemporary worship services, it's largely a twofold service where there's extended singing, extended teaching, go home. So nobody's going to say, well, that was, God wasn't in it. Nobody's going to say that, and nobody's going to, which I don't believe. I think God is in it, and nobody's going to say, well, it wasn't worship. No, it probably was worship. But the question is, does it fit, again, the sensibilities that we see in the narrative of the word and over time? And does it seem to offer the people the best relational, covenantal experience with God and one another? Probably not. So, again, it's maybe better best than it is right wrong.
Yeah. I like the analogy of load-bearing wall because it seems to help us think about God's role in the service and how we can lean on, as people who are designers. Sometimes it feels like we have to in my circles, someone once basically had so much pressure to make the next Sunday bigger than the last that they literally said
Yeah.
jokingly to us, they said, "I think next Sunday I've just got to light a clown on fire on stage." And yeah, it meant humorously to feel like all this weight, pressure as a designer to really engage the congregation in meaningful ways. And each Sunday, this amping up and amping up. But this load-bearing walls you're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but let me circle back to something you said earlier that I think helps at this point. When you were talking about Jesus Christ as the foundation of worship, what I would like to do is add, not only is he the foundation in terms of the theological foundation, the word, the centerpiece, so to speak, doctrinally, but even more importantly to me, Jesus Christ is the center relationally of the service. And so if I must believe, I do believe, that the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ is present when the church gathers to worship. And so I'm not only leaning on the doctrine I have and hold of the Son of God, I am actually leaning more so on the reality that he is there as one of us leading our worship. And the reason it strikes me as important is I have a good friend, Lester Ruth, who teaches worship research at Duke, and he has told me, and I've heard him say this before, that when worship leaders say that it's their job to get something going, to beat themselves the next week around, in other words, get something going better and more exciting week after week after week, and build up this pressure, they were, people will say, oh, to make God present, excuse me, that's beyond your pay grade. I mean, Jesus is already present, and you can't produce his presence, and you can't create his his presence among you. And so to take the pressure off of worship leaders, my goodness, to say that we have to keep creating things to appeal to people is well beyond the bounds. I mean, it's not even doctrinally sound, because it's well beyond the bounds of, we're overlooking the sheer fact that the most magnificent experience that awaits us is the meeting with the risen Lord. It's looks past Jesus instead of to and through Jesus.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you so much for guiding us in that. For many leaders, I think worship design also encompasses the songs they select. We should touch on that. What is it about the song selection process as a part of the design of worship? How would you encourage leaders to think about how they select songs?
Well, there's a couple of ways that are very popular ways to go about it that I don't think are the best ways. So a lot of people will just look to whatever's high on the charts and do those, or their favorite particular songs, or again, creating a mood. And so I know lots and lots of worship leaders who come at the song selection from those directions. But again, I think I would, I know I would. I teach my students to say what's happening in the service at this moment. That's your starting place. Are you stepping into the presence of God and need to acknowledge God's presence? Let's go look for a song that does that. And then, are you going to sing of God's majesty, of his glory, of his beauty, as you enter into his presence? Let's go look for a song for that. So the question becomes, where is the liturgy leading you? And I use the word liturgy very broadly. It's not a set liturgy per se. I mean, that's not how I'm speaking of it usually. But by liturgy, what the actual sequence of events that every church uses. It's free, it's dependent from Pentecostal to Missouri Synod Lutheran. But just to ask what's happening in the service at this moment, where are we walking through these rooms, and then looking for songs that help the congregation travel through these rooms as they experience God and one another. And so, it will I mean, there will be some times when we consider, I don't like the word mood, and I try to use the word tone. It might be an artificial difference that I draw, but I don't think we're called to create moods. I think we're called to do liturgies, but I do think that there will be tones throughout the service that are more reflective than others, and that can guide you, and certainly, your repertoire will guide you, and there'll be considerations. Another big one is just to think in terms of the Trinity and songs as a double check to make sure that persons of the Trinity are represented properly, theologically speaking. Looking at songs that are both corporate and individual. Looking at songs that are looking for a balance between songs of exhortation and songs of praise and songs of prayer, petition. So there's so many grids through which you're going to process the song selection. But the grids that aren't necessarily the best are, again, let's start with fast and get to slow. And then let's make sure we build in the latest hits and get to, go from there. Those are, forgive me, those are rather carnal, superficial approaches to it. And again, there's better.
Yeah, as selection criteria. Because something's
correct.
new doesn't mean you should be using it per se, but maybe it fits the other criteria you're mentioning, and that's a good reason to go for it. One thing that you said actually reminded me of something. In learning how to preach, one of my preacher professors mentioned that designing a sermon is like going on a pilgrimage. And when you go on a pilgrimage, you have to get in the bus, go somewhere. When you get there, you get out of the bus. You do the things that's on that site, get back in the bus, you go to the next site, you get out, you do the things that are at that site. And I think that what you said is so helpful to think about, that in a liturgy, we're taking people on a journey. And sometimes you got to attend to the pieces that connect pieces together, and sometimes you got to help people experience or to encounter or to whatever word you want to use, but to walk around in that room that they're in. And that's really helpful as a way of thinking about it.
I mean, in the end, Steve, worship is from, through, to. It's from our individual worlds together through an experience with God, and then to the world where we live out our worship in practical ways, and then we return for from, through, to, and that's very much a journey motif.
Yeah,
that you come from somewhere, you experience something, and you go to somewhere as a result, and then this cycle is done weekly, which is a wonderful rhythm of a journey rhythm. Yeah.
There's something you mentioned that I'd like to go back to, and that was in this metaphor of architecture and buildings, that houses have features in common, but they also look different in California and in Colorado and in the East Coast, and that's good, and that's kind of engagement with culture. Do you have any suggestions or tips for people who are maybe struggling with that part of being an architect of worship? How do they engage their cultures? How can they attend to the cultural particularities and yet stay true to that divine narrative, kind of holding those in tension?
I think two things come to my mind. First is that you don't start with culture, you end with culture. And so instead of saying, okay, what would we like to do that's going to show people that we are relevant to their world, and then that kind of takes us off in one direction. But I would say we start with, what does worship have to be and do? And then we interpret it through the culture that we see. So for me, the first thing is just the starting place, because I know lots
Mm-hmm.
of worship leaders who just start with culture first and what, what's hot, what's not, and let's do that. The second thing is that really culture, again, is about relationships. And I don't think that I think we presume a lot about culture. First of all, we throw that word around like there's one culture.
Right.
And there isn't. And I think most people think of that in terms of popular culture, but even so, who's popular culture?
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking about? So, that's just become a buzzword that has kind of lost all meaning. But culture, to me, comes through relationship, where I have to now spend a lot of time with my people. I have to know my people. I have to love my people. I have to be in their lives and theirs and mine. So culture is a relational thing. You can't just paint culture on top of a service. You have to. Culture is interpreted contextually, and we make far too many presumptions, because I've learned in a lot of years of experience in ministry, I've learned that I assumed certain things about my people that simply were not true until I discovered in my time with them that they have a whole different perspective than I thought they did, than I presumed they did.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that culture is a slow dawn. It's not taking from television or internet what we're told is our culture, but it's in fact loving and getting to know relationally our people, and then perceiving the culture and interpreting the paradigms of worship in light of that. So those are the thoughts that come to mind. It's slower, it's harder work.
Mm-hmm.
It is, but it's better work, and it's truer work to do.
Thank you for driving us back to the conversation and the relational part. I hear that throughout the entire conversation we've had, that none of these aspects of worship, they're relational. They're not just ideas or something. Like what you said, you can't just paint culture on the outside of the building. It's not that easy. That's a really helpful, insightful thing. Yeah. Dr. Cherry, it's been such a wonderful conversation with you today. Thank you for the time you spent encouraging our listeners. Looking forward to the revised edition of Worship Architect coming out. Do you know, does that have a release date coming? I know you're working on it currently.
Yeah. They plan to issue it in 2021, but I'm not sure when. I would think the summer of 2021.
Awesome.
It'll go into, I'll submit it here in the next week, and then it goes into production, and it usually takes about a year to get it out, but it will be out, God willing, middle of 2021.
Yeah. Can I ask what kind of revisions or updates?
Yeah, sure. The paradigm, the metaphor hasn't changed. I'm going to stick with the worship architect, and the title doesn't change. But I think the biggest changes have come in the chapters on music. It's been out 10 years, and so there are some major updates needed there. Secondly, the chapter on worship styles has changed quite a bit. And so that chapter has changed quite a bit. I also have written a new chapter called Global Worship, and I explain that even though multicultural worship is one piece of that, I'm using the term global worship to think about expansive worship in the sense of who are all of the participants of worship. Like I try to make a case for multi-ethnic, for multiracial, but also for multi-generational, for special needs, just to say, who are the worshipers? In fact, I used a little simple rhyme that my mother taught me. This is in the book, that here is the church, here is the steeple, open the door and see all the people. It's a little hand game rhyme thing. And so the problem is, if we open the door and see all the people, who are the people that we're not seeing? Yeah. So I look at that as global worship. And I try to tackle, in the introduction, I try to tackle the problem with the fact that we have one word for worship that we use ubiquitously, and it's kind of lost its meaning. So many people think of worship in so many ways that it's become generic. So I take a look at what do we really mean by corporate worship, and how is it distinctive than worship concerts, worship conferences, worship 24/7, worship whatever. So I'm a big fan. I will tell you, word of warning, I'm a big fan of the church at worship as being the pinnacle or the peak or the center of all other worships, so to speak. And that it's not just one among many worshiping opportunities, but it is the center for worship for people and God, and everything else kind of satellites around that. So those are a few of the things that are a little different in there.
Looking forward to it. My own tradition calls the divine service or Sunday morning gathering the Hauptgottesdienst, and that was their way of also kind of what you're saying. They viewed it as the center of all that.
I think it is.
Yeah. I
think it is.
Well, this has been a really delightful conversation. I want to end with a final question, if you don't mind, and it's a bit of a like a German thought experiment. So just go with me on this. Pretend that there is a billboard that exists and a road that goes past the billboard. And then somehow, magically, every worship leader on their way to church on Sunday morning or whatever day they have a service has to drive by that billboard, and they see it on their way in. Do you have any ideas? What should we put on that billboard as everyone drives in Sunday morning, that they see it and be encouraged, or whatever message you would give them? What would you put on that?
Well, Steve, I will tell you what I put on it, but I want to preface this by saying I'm coming at this from, I would say, 30 years. I mean, I've been at ministry longer than that. I just finished 45, but I would say the last 30 years, God has really impressed on me the necessity of Christ-centered worship and the oversight that we make of that. So I would put on the billboard, worship begins and ends with Jesus Christ.
All right, we'll put it on there then.
All right, put it on there,
That's
buddy.
a good one. Dr. Cherry, thank you again for all your time today, for sharing your wisdom. If you're interested in following Dr. Cherry's work, we will put a link on the show notes to some of her books. You can click and order them and read more about her thoughts on worship. Really honored again to spend time with you this afternoon.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much, and I pray God's blessing on all your listeners.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Theology in Motion with Reverend Dr. Constance Cherry. If you enjoyed it, I invite you to give us some kind of rating or feedback or comments. That way, new listeners might have an idea of what to expect when they find our show and what kind of quality they'll find with these interviews and guests that bring such wonderful wisdom to those working in the church in the area of worship. The Center for Worship Leadership now has 3 podcasts in our podcast network, each one focusing on one of the 3 areas of teaching at the Center for Worship Leadership, the 3 cores. This show is about the theology of worship. Our second show, On the Ground Floor, hosted by Matt Preston, is one about ministry leadership and leaders telling the stories of their ministries. Lastly, our third show is How the Soup is Made, hosted by Corey Witt, in which we discuss the skills it takes to do some of this stuff at the local church. A lot of times, how to be a better guitar player, how to encourage your teams. Check it out. It might be a great place to point a budding guitar player, bass player, drummer to be encouraged about the tricks and philosophy of the trade. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you next month for our episode with Dr. Simeon Zoll. We're talking about his new book, Holy Spirit and the Christian Experience. And we're going to bring that book into the conversation of worship. And we'll see you next month.